Hello everyone, Nathaniel Gavronsky here, and I am at the Hermitage in just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and this is the gravesite of Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was born in parts of history that has been lost in what is the border between North and South Carolina, in what is more like an Indian reservation for the time, or an Indian tribal area, and he was born on March 15th, 1767. Now, he was born to two Irish immigrants, and he has two older brothers that were born before his family came to the United States. His father died due to an accident before Jackson was born, and he was 10 years old when the Revolutionary War broke out. Now, during the war, his mother encouraged Jackson and his two older brothers to go aid the American cause, and they did so. His oldest brother died from heat stroke after a battle, and Jackson and his remaining brother were captured when they were staying at their aunt and uncle's house, the Crawfords, when the British took over the Crawford farm. It was at this point that one of the British officers ordered Jackson to clean and polish his shoes, and when Jackson refused, the British officer took out his saber and struck Jackson with it. When Jackson raised his hand to protect from the blow, he struck his hand. It gave him a nasty scar and an indentation on his forehead that he was known to kind of rub his finger against when he was very, very aggravated. Now, Jackson, after completing his time aiding in the American cause during the Revolutionary War, he went to go study law. His mother died when she was trying to aid prisoners being held by the British outside of Charleston, and so he was an orphan, and he had to go find a way to make ends meet. And he chose law to do that. He was a relatively good lawyer and was chosen to be the prosecutor for the territory of the Carolinas that would become Tennessee, and he set up shop in Nashville. He became the first congressman for Tennessee when Tennessee became a state in 1796, and would later become the U.S. Senator from Tennessee. However, he resigned shortly thereafter, so he could become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the state of Tennessee. It was actually during this time that he had met another up-and-coming family from the Carolinas, the Polk family. Samuel Polk was a prominent lawyer just south of Nashville in Columbia, Tennessee, and it is believed that this is the time when Jackson would meet his one-day protege, James K. Polk. After being a successful lawyer, he had to resign his post as the Supreme Court Justice over financial needs, and he actually came out and took over the Hermitage and built this house here, and this is where he kind of spent the rest of his remaining days, as far as his political career, his army career, all kind of stemmed from out of the Hermitage Mansion, which you can kind of see just behind me here. I'm going to be going on a tour of that here in a few minutes. So Jackson wanted ambition. He did it through military actions. He was most famously known during the Creek War, when he was able, during the War of 1812, because a lot of the Native Americans were actually fighting alongside the British during the War of 1812. Jackson, who hated all things British, took this as the Indians were just as bad as the British, and was notorious for fighting the Native Americans with great ferocity. And he went down to Florida, and he fought off a bunch of the Indians that were coming from Spanish Florida into Georgia, and he pushed a lot of them back, leading to a crisis with the Spanish and the British government, because the Spaniards were supposed to be neutral during this conflict, and by the Spaniards allowing the British to use Florida as a launching place for British assaults, it made a terrible stain on Spanish-American relations. After the Battle of Pensacola, where Jackson decisively defeated both British and Spanish troops, he found out that the British were sending a massive amount of soldiers and support to the city of New Orleans that they planned to take. And by the time that Jackson got there to New Orleans on December 1st of 1814, and the British got there a couple of weeks later and were preparing to, fight. Jackson declared martial law in New Orleans, and most of his troops that he had about 5,000, and he was famous for actually paying his non-whites, his Indians and former slaves, for other free black men, equal amount of money as he did his white soldiers. And he was able to amass an army of about 5,000 men, where the British came in with over 10,000. The British came in, the battle took place on January 8th, 1815. Now, of course, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, but that didn't matter. The British actually did have a plan that they were able to take New Orleans. They would have been able to continuously harass the Americans from New Orleans and along the Mississippi and then the Missouri River. So the fact that the British were decisively defeated here, with over 2,000 casualties to Jackson's like 68 casualties, was a tremendous difference in as far as a lopsided victory as far as Jackson was concerned, and it made Jackson a national hero across all of the United States. He did have some tarnishments, though, because he kept martial law in New Orleans for a long time, and when a state legislature argued that he couldn't keep New Orleans under martial law, Jackson had that state legislator arrested. A federal district court for the area also ordered a habeas corpus charge for the state senator, and then Jackson had that justice thrown out of and banished from New Orleans. This was a really bad tarnishment on Jackson's military career, but he was seen as the victor of the Battle of New Orleans and was awarded many medals by Congress for his great service to the country. After the War of 1812, the Spanish Florida continued to be a problem. In fact, a lot of Spanish raiders would come over along with Indians to attack areas along the Florida-Georgia line. Jackson had enough of this and actually went across the line, which he wasn't allowed to do, and he actually took out the Spanish forts there and decisively defeated the Spanish forces in Florida. This made an international scene because he wasn't allowed to do that. President Monroe at the time didn't give him permission to do that, and the Spanish wanted blood. Well, Monroe couldn't very easily, convict and execute the greatest war hero of the time. I mean, Jackson was seen as the second coming of George Washington during this time period. So Monroe really couldn't, execute or hand over Jackson. So he basically told the Spanish either hand over Florida or we're going to take it. The Spanish obliged. There was a financial deal that went through, and Florida became part of the United States and became a U.S. territory. So after the War of 1812, Jackson wanted to return to the U.S. Senate, and he was able to successfully do that thanks to his protege, James Polk, who became a state legislator in the Tennessee State House, and on his second go-around was able to push Jackson into the U.S. Senate seat, which was a precursor to Jackson running for U.S. president. Now, in 1824, when Jackson first ran for the presidency, there was a situation in the U.S. House of Representatives where the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and the former Secretary of State, John Q. Adams, they didn't win the popular vote, nor did they win enough of the Electoral College to win. In fact, Jackson won the popular vote and the most Electoral College votes, but not enough to get him over the edge, so it was sent to the House of Representatives. And Clay, who was opposition to Jackson, pushed for changed his position and moved a lot of his supporters over to John Quincy Adams. This was known as being one of the most corrupt deals ever made in the House of Representatives, which gave John Quincy Adams his one-term presidency. Now, Quincy Adams was basically trying to show he could do a better job than his father, John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, and utterly failed. So, in the 1828 election that Jackson promised he would run in, Jackson ran away with it. It was a complete landslide. Jacksonian era of the United States, which is the only time period in the United States that it's known after one person, Andrew Jackson. The Jackson era of American politics had begun. Now, for better or for worse, there's a lot of things about this that people need to realize, and I can't get into all of it here. I'm never going to get into all of the justices for his victims and all the praise for his proponents, but I will talk to you a little bit about some of the things that he did. One is that he had a massive hatred towards Native Americans. This is because he saw them, most of them allying with the British during the War of 1812, the Creek War, and also what happened in Spanish Florida. He didn't like them, and he ordered them removed. So the Indian Removal Act. There was also a situation down in Georgia, the border of Georgia, where the Chickasaw and the Cherokee Indians, the land that they had, they found gold on it. And Jackson said, I don't care, you need to move. And the Indian tribes sued Jackson at the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of the United States backed the Indian tribes. And this was during John Marshall's time at the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the people of Georgia and Jackson decided to not listen or obey the Supreme Court, and was famously known as saying, well, John Marshall has made his decision, let's see him enforce it. At this point, the Jackson sent down the army and forcefully removed the Native Americans there. This was part of the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears wasn't just a one-time occurrence. This took place over a long period of time, to where 40,000 or so Indians were killed due to forced marches without food, without water, into what is now Oklahoma. It is actually one of the biggest stains on America's history, with the forceful removal of the Native Americans. In fact, when this act came in to be voted on, only one of Tennessee's delegates to Congress voted against it, and that was Davy Crockett. And this would actually finalize the conversation between Davy Crockett and Jackson, where they did not like each other. And Jackson actually pushed for Davy Crockett to be pushed out of Congress during the next cycle, and Davy Crockett was removed from Congress over this vote. But it didn't help. All the Indians were forcibly removed from all of Tennessee and all throughout the South, out into Oklahoma. Jackson also hated paper money. He also thought that this was a big cause of inflation. He hated the Bank of the United States. He viewed the Bank of the United States to be a institution for only the wealthy, and that this actually hurt many average everyday citizens. He believed, and this was Jackson's honest to God belief, is that the only wealth was really land, that all this other commerce and all this financialization of banking was just a way for the wealthy, mostly all own land, to keep the working men and the working poor. And so he absolutely hated the Bank of the United States, and he saw it as being part of the aristocracy of the United States and the elitization of the United States, which Jackson adamantly opposed. So Jackson was promising to derail and to not renew the Bank of the United States' charter. And at the end of his second term, when the charter came up to renewal, he vetoed it. Now, thanks to his efforts politically, when he had James K. Polk was now the Speaker of the House, they were able to prevent a overturn of Jackson's veto, leading to the Bank of the United States to fail. And Jackson then created what they call little pet banks. And they quit putting money into the Bank of the United States. They started putting all these little pet banks that basically they loaned the money out to whoever came asking for it. It caused a lot of problems for the United States, especially our economy. And this is seen as one of Jackson's greatest achievements, and one of his legacy aspects that were actually detrimental to the United States economy. In fact, another thing he did, again, was if you want to buy land, you had to buy it in gold or silver. Paper money wasn't accepted, and so land speculation basically ground to a halt. This devastated the U.S. economy even further. And he believed that he's doing this to actually expand the rights of the average everyday citizens, especially people out in the West who didn't have access to a lot of this wealth and financialization. He thought it was benefiting them, and it was detrimental to the entire country. But Jackson also believed he was doing the right thing. Now, as his another major thing that took place during Jackson's presidency was the nullification. South Carolina was first threatening to secede from the Union during Jackson's second term, during the nullification of tariffs that ordered by the federal government. Now, these tariffs were to deal with problems with the British government and exports, and some of the things that were going on in maritime disputes between the French, the British, and the United States. And Jackson wanted to, put an end to this by creating tariffs. This devastated the South Carolina economy, and they vowed to fight against it. And the nullification that South Carolina did, we're not going to enforce it. You want to come enforce your tariffs, you come down here and you try to enforce these tariffs. And so it became a situation to where the beginnings of the fissures between North and South were beginning, and South Carolina was looking to secede in the Jacksonian presidency. But Jackson was able to do some amendments, work with his, with his first-term vice president, who was Calhoun, who was from South Carolina, and work with others in the government to actually kind of smooth things over for a period of time, and they were able to move forward, and South Carolina did not promise to secede for about 30 years later. Jackson only took his 2 terms, and then after his 2 terms were over, he retired back to the Hermitage, which is right over here. He picked his hand-picked successor, his vice president, Martin Van Buren, who was governor of New York at the time. After previously being a part of the Jackson administration, Van Buren went to become governor of New York, and then returned to the vice presidency in the Jackson administration, and then pushed forward to the president, to the White House, as Jackson went to go step down. Now, this would have been the last consecutive Democrat or Republican Democrat to hold office, as Van Buren actually lost his bid for re-election in 1840, and this was mostly caused because of some of the turmoil that happened during Jackson's removal of the Bank of the United States, and the fact that you had to use gold or silver to buy land. Jackson's best person who was his ally in the government, which was James K. Polk, saw the writing on the wall and resigned and quit the U.S. House in 38 to go run for Tennessee governor in 1839, which he did win, because Tennessee was going against Jackson at a lot of the different levels and was becoming a Whig state opposed to Jacksonians Democrats. And so Polk returned to Tennessee along with Jackson and held the governorship but only for 2 years before he lost re-election and then lost a subsequent attempt to regain the governor's mansion. Jackson played a huge part, though, in Polk's ascendancy to the presidency, basically because Van Buren, being a Northerner, and the main aspect of the national issues during Jackson's time as president was expansion. See, Jackson recognized Texas's independence from Mexico, but he wasn't able to annex it yet. That would actually happen a few years later. But he wanted to expand. He wanted California. He wanted all of the Oregon territory. The term, 5440 or fight. And so this was a big aspect of the Jacksonian era, was the expansion of the United States. Now, Jackson was able to, indirectly take Spanish Florida and make Florida into a U.S. territory. But Jackson and Manifest Destiny, which kind of culminated at the beginning of Jackson's term, was Manifest Destiny, which was Sea to Shining Sea, which would have required Oregon and California and all those parts that were belonged to, had either an agreement with Britain for shared use or belonged to the nation of Mexico. And so this became an issue. And so when the election came about in 1844, Van Buren spoke out against expanding and annexing Texas, mostly because of the idea of, well, it would become a slave or a free state. Same with Oregon, would become a free or a slave state. Even though a lot of the area wasn't believed to be culpable for slavery to work because the type of land it was in, it was still seen as a way of expanding slavery and expanding the Democrat hold and balance in the Senate. Don't forget, at this time, 2 states came in at a time, one free, one slave state. And even after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, states still came in, one Republican or one conservative state and one liberal or Democrat state. That's the reason why we have 2 Dakotas. This process continued throughout the entirety of the United States. Even Alaska and Hawaii came in under the guise of one of a Republican and one of Democrat states, because we only had 2 senators from each side. That's why there's such a close balance in the U.S. Senate. So this question on how the power and the balance of the Senate was playing out early on in the expansionary wills of Jackson. And when Polk was the only one who actually talked about how he wanted to expand and annex Texas, and Van Buren said, I don't want to annex Texas. I don't think it's good. And Calhoun said he didn't want to annex Texas. It became very clear to Jackson that his best bet for expansion in the United States was James K. Polk. So when the convention took place to pick the nominee for the Democratic Party for the 1844 election, Van Buren was trying for it, Calhoun was trying for it, And Polk promised, well, I'm a supporter of Van Buren. I'm a supporter of Van Buren. I'm going to be his vice president. It took 9 ballots, and Van Buren quickly realized that he wasn't going to win it because of his opposition to annexation. Once Polk's name was suggested, Polk got it. It took a couple. Van Buren pulled his support, told all of his supporters to join with Polk. Calhoun shortly thereafter also agreed that Polk would be the best possible alternative and a candidate that had the best chance of winning. And so the rise of the dark horse, James K. Polk, was mostly thanks to Jackson's pushing and pressuring, saying, hey, I want an expansionist. I want someone who's going to agree to annex Texas. I want someone who's going to expand and go for California, go for the Oregon Territory. Polk supported those ideas, and Jackson became the kingmaker and pushed Polk into the nomination for the presidency. And since the Whigs, with Tyler's disastrous term as the president, which he ascended to the presidency from the vice presidency once Harrison died, the Whigs did not support him. He had no party. He actually was the one in the last minutes of his administration annexed Texas and sent the annexation agreements to Texas, and it was finalized under the Polk term of presidency on the Texas side, but was agreed to by the U.S. Senate under Tyler. And so one of Tyler's biggest legacies was a Polk promise for presidency. So Jackson was a big proponent and spoke very highly of James K. Polk. And Polk came to Jackson many times for questions and for help and dealing with during the Mexican-American War. Jackson was great helpful to Polk's administration as an advisor, even from the Hermitage here in retirement. Sadly, though, Jackson was not able to see the fulfillment of all of his dreams. He died here on June 8th, 1845, just a few years before the ending of the Mexican-American War. Another interesting thing about Jackson is his dueling. He first one to survive an assassination attempt. Someone tried to shoot him, and he actually went to go beat the guy up. The guy's gun misfired as he was sitting president of the United States, and Jackson rushed. In fact, he had to get Jackson's own men had to pull Jackson off the would-be assassin. So Jackson had been shot several times. There was a duel with Dickinson over a horse bet that Dickinson, made a slur towards Jackson's wife that he did not very much approve of, Rachel. And Jackson and Rachel's relationship. So Jackson and Rachel Donaldson, they met while Jackson was boarding at the elder Rachel Donaldson's house with her mother, who was a widow. And Andrew Jackson and the younger Rachel Donaldson fell in love. However, Rachel was already married to someone else at the time, and Jackson didn't really care. They ran off anyway. And this became a problem for Jackson throughout the rest of his life, because he would always defend her honor to the death of the other person. So Jackson had over 100 duels. He was known to be very, very, very hard and brash. And he got the name Old Hickory, Hickory being a very, very strong piece of wood, because he was known for being so ferocious. And the Old Hickory was true to form. He said what he wanted to say, and he didn't care if you liked it or not. If you didn't disagree with him, fine, he didn't care. What he said went for his world, and he got what he wanted most of the time. It broke his heart when Rachel did die, and he mourned the rest of his life the loss of his beloved wife. And whenever anyone would criticize him and her relationship, he would adamantly fight them. And his first inauguration, the White House was open to the public. They trashed the place. He had to get $50,000 to remodel it because they literally tore it apart. He did a lot of great work, though. There was a lot of, controversy with Jackson. A lot. Jackson had a lot of issues, but he did what he could to do what he did best for the United States of America. And for better or for worse, Jackson, with all of his controversies, served the people of the United States to the best of his ability. He was born for the storm, and because the calm didn't suit him. So that's Andrew Jackson. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and share this video, and comment what you think about him. I couldn't go into, there's a lot of controversy about him. I'm not going to go into all of it. A lot of people hate him, a lot of people love him, but that is Jackson in a nutshell. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.